Now, there are three DHCP mechanisms discussed in the ccna, and these often cause a lot of confusion because the names are counterintuitive. Most of us in the real world use the term automatic to imply dynamic allocation, but for this course there's a differentiation between automatic allocation, dynamic allocation, and manual allocation. Please note that all of these allocations are specific configurations done on a DHCP server and not on the client PC. So we're talking about a manual allocation in DHCP rather than the static configuration of an IP address on a client PC or phone. So the first one, automatic allocation, is where the DHCP server is configured to assign a permanent IP address to a client. In automatic allocation, the IP address lease is set to infinity. In other words, it doesn't expire. The IP address that is given to a client doesn't expire once that IP address is allocated to that client. The IP address configured in DHCP is always allocated to that specific client based on, for example, the client's MAC address. Now, dynamic allocation is what most of us think about when talking about DHCP or when configuring DHCP. This is where the server allocates an IP address to a client for a limited amount of time or limited period of time, such as 3 days. Best practices for the lease period are very much dependent on customer requirements and the devices involved. In an IP telephony environment where you have physical handsets, the devices are generally static and do not move around, so a lease period of 7 days or 1 week is typical. However, where you have an environment where salespeople are using hot desking, in other words, only coming into the office on certain days of the week, and where they don't have a static desk allocated to them, but are sharing desks with other salespeople, you may decide to only allocate IP addresses for a lease period of 1 day. Manual allocation is not manually configuring IP addresses on client devices. What you're doing here is pre-allocating IP addresses to a device in the DHCP server. So you as the administrator would statically define a mapping between an IP address and MAC address in the DHCP pool, for example. So when the device with a specific MAC address requests an IP address from the DHCP server is going to allocate the IP address to the client as you specified. So when a device with a specific MAC address requests an IP address from the DHCP server is simply conveying the assigned IP address to the client. So rather than you configuring the IP address statically or manually on the client, you configuring the IP address and MAC address on the DHCP server, and then using the DHCP server to convey or give that information to the client. Now please note that there's a difference between automatic allocation and manual allocation. In manual allocation, you have to pre-configure the IP address and the MAC address that's going to be allocated to a specific client. Whereas with automatic allocation, you just create a pool or scope of addresses that are then allocated to devices on a first-come, first-served basis. As soon as a specific MAC address gets an IP address, that IP address is permanently allocated to that specific MAC address, whereas with manual allocation, you are manually configuring a mapping between a MAC address and an IP address. Please note that dynamic allocation is the only one of the three methods that allows for the reuse of IP addresses by other devices. Once your lease has expired, that IP address can be allocated to other devices, whereas with automatic and manual allocation, once an IP address is assigned to a specific device, that device always gets to use that specific IP address. So in DHCP discussions, we're typically talking about dynamic allocation. But for ccna, be aware that we have automatic allocation, dynamic allocation, and manual allocation.